Imbibitor Lunae Dan Heng quite literally hits like a truck, and in this video, I am going to talk about his place in the meta, things that you need to know about him, whether you already have him or not, as well as cover some important questions like how to efficiently manage his skill points while dealing a ton of damage. And most importantly, I will showcase the most powerful teams you can build with him right now. So let's first talk about the new amazing teams that you can build with Imbibitor Lunae and how unique they're going to be compared to what we're used to. Now, I won't be delving too deep into Super Saiyan Dawn's kit. A lot of the basic stuff has been covered by other great content creators, and instead, I want to show you things that I believe haven't been talked about in depth. Now, the biggest thing about Dan Heng is the insane amount of damage he can pump out with this skill. You can consume up to 3 skill points to deliver an ever-increasingly better skill attack, or should I say basic attack, and if you use his ultimate or technique, he can consume these unique stacks he obtains instead of skill points. Because of this mechanic, you will want to build teams that can help with this heavy skill point consumption, and each of these teams are interesting in their own way. So the first team is the baseline free-to-play comp. Pela is going to be the new Dan Heng's best friend because by himself, he can boost his damage pretty well by getting crit damage from his skill and even increasing his damage output from his talent each time he attacks. Now, one of the most important things to be aware of, as I mentioned, is the skill point economy you'll need to manage when playing any kind of Imbibitor Lunae team. Pela doesn't really need to use their skill that often, unless you need to strip away an important buff from an enemy, like the one from Shapeshifter. Otherwise, you just use her ultimate to reduce every enemy's defense, and then hit for big damage with Dan Heng. I know you can get more energy by using Pela's skill, but you can work around this with an energy rope on her, or by using the light cone before the tutorial mission starts. The next lot should be taken by Natasha. Since this is a free-to-play team, assuming you have no other healer, Natasha will have to put in the work, while the last slot could be March 7th. Her shield increases the chance of enemies attacking the buffed ally, so she can give a nice boost of energy to Dan Heng. Or you could instead go with Fire Trailblazer, who is an extremely skill point efficient character. Otherwise, Ting Yun can act as a buffer, since her ultimate can restore Dan Heng's ultimate energy, which means he can obtain these special stacks more often and avoid consuming the actual skill points. Now, the next team is probably my favorite one, Mono Imaginary with Silverwolf. Welt is an excellent support here, mostly because you will be using his ultimate as the main source of debuffing. His skill, while great, can put a damper on the skill point economy, while the ultimate is a great way to put enemies into imprisoned state and allow Dan Heng to fully utilize the Wastelanders set, which provides 20% crit damage against imprisoned enemies. Like, sure, if you break the enemy's weaknesses with Dan Heng, he can also apply Imprisoned, but Welt does it just so much better, and he can apply this on all enemies, which is super relevant since Dan Heng can hit up to 3 enemies. Now, this next team, it's a bit of a work in progress as of now, but you can use both the Imbibitor Lunae and Blade as a double damage dealer comp. You will need to use Luocha to make this team work, and the other character could be either Pela or Silverwolf, since debuffing enemies for double damage dealer comps is really efficient. Otherwise, you can go with Ting Yun as well. The reason why I say this team is work in progress is because you won't often hit the triple powered basic attack, since even if Blade only consumes a single SP every 3 turns, he doesn't regenerate them with his enhanced basic attack. So there will be situations where Dan Heng can only power up the basic attack twice. Still, it's a fun team to play with. I was able to clear with it the final memory of Chaos Chamber, and it will only get better if we can get a character in the future that can provide skill points for the team. But this next team, it definitely requires some fine-tuning to get the best out of it. Here, you can use Bronya to boost Dan Heng's damage with her skill, but the tricky part comes with the speed management. Thanks to Grimm's Insight, a Star Rail content creator, you would want to have 2 other supports with at least 136 speed, while Dan Heng has 135 and Bronya has 134. This way, the team first obtains some skill points, Dan Heng uses his 0-powered basic attack, and then afterwards, Bronya uses her skill, and then finally, the new Dan Heng can unleash triple-powered basic attack, and at this point, there should be enough energy to use his ultimate and go into this rotation of dishing out a ton of damage. This of course depends on Dan Heng's equipment, which I'll talk about later in the video. Finally, the most comfy team that I've seen being run by a lot of people, which means it's quite meta, is by using Luocha, Silverwolf, and one more support like Ting Yun or Pela. Luocha doesn't consume that many skill points, Silverwolf's skill will be used seldom to just apply a weakness, while the other support like Ting Yun can help with boosting Dan Heng's energy, which also means he will more often use the stacks he obtains from the ultimate to unleash the triple powered basic. But yeah, these teams are all interesting to play, but probably the biggest takeaway here would be to build a team so that everyone who is generating skill points for Dan Heng have at least 147 speed, which essentially allows everyone to take more turns every 7 cycles, while Dan Heng can use attack boost and be slower than others, which means he activates less, but in return, he doesn't consume that many skill points. Of course, you could build him with speed boots and speed substats, but for now, I find him to be super easy to play with by just going slow, unless you're playing that Bronya team I mentioned previously. So this Moon Drinker deals a ton of damage, that's for sure, but what about his place in the meta? Well, first of all, we have to look at the upcoming memory turbulence changes, since this will dictate his power level over the coming weeks. And the first memory buff is really funny. Starting from September 4th, a Trotter will be summoned at the beginning of each new wave or cycle. This little space piggy will take 200% more damage from basic attacks and DOTs, which obviously is tailor-made for Dan Heng's and Kafka teams. And by blowing up this pig, everyone in the team will restore 2 skill points. And I cannot tell you how much freedom this gives to a lot of team comps that you'll be able to experiment with by using Dan Heng. For example, the double damage dealer comp with Blade, now it works perfectly fine, and Dan Heng can almost always unleash his triple powered basic, while comps with Tingyun and Bronya together can boost up his damage really well without thinking too much about SP. Now, the other memory buff will also feature a Warp Trotter showing up in each new wave or cycle, and this time, it will take more damage from basic attacks and ultimates, and once it's turned into Space Bacon, it will deal a fixed amount of damage to all enemies. How much damage it's going to be, it's not clear yet, but probably significant enough. Although I think the first memory buff is a bit cooler and allows you to build teams with less restrictions. But with these memory turbulence buffs out of the way, the new Dan Heng has some serious firepower built into him. But not only that, he can easily chew away a ton of enemies' toughness bars, as you can see here. Like, he reduces decent amount by just enhancing his basic once, to taking out a lot of it when it's fully powered up. And that's going to be relevant because he does reign supreme against enemies weak to imaginary damage, especially since he deals 24% more crit damage against enemies who have imaginary weakness. All in all, I think right now, he does require a lot of team's effort to make sure he has 3 skill points ready, so he can activate his fully powered basic attack, and that means your supports will be weaker in return, but on the flip side, if you do utilize the team this way, he can start hitting enemies with his fully powered basic, ranging from 100 to 200k damage, and he can even do a 30 to 70k ultimate as a cherry on top. These numbers for a newly released character are really good, and he does establish himself as one of the top tier damage dealers, although you will need to be aware of the skill point consumption. Now, there are a few build considerations we need to go over. First of all, his best general build is Wastelander's Force set with the new Rutilant Arena Planar set, while the main stats should be the ones shown here. And keep in mind, you can also use one of the recommended alternative sets shown here. Honestly, the biggest choice you'll need to make is whether you want him to be fast or not. For now, after all the teams and calcs I ran, attack boots seem more comfy, but you can definitely go with speed boots and substats instead, for teams like with Bronya. However, keep in mind, his skill consumption will go up, and you'll need to find a way to trigger that triple powered basic consistently. The only other thing that's really worth talking about would be his light cone options. Obviously, the best in slot is the signature. In fact, it is better to get it if you're torn between his first Eidolon or Brighter Than the Sun. The signature provides more damage, and it can be used by other destruction characters who scale with attack. However, if you are willing to push for E2, then it's definitely a super strong upgrade for him, allowing him to act for the second time with all the stacks ready after using his ultimate. Still, when it comes to other options, On the Fall of Aeon at S5 is a really excellent choice, although you will need to spend Herta's shop currency to fully max it out. But it is worth it, as it's not that very conditional to take full advantage of, while other options like Something Irreplaceable or the Unreachable Side, which are both 5-star cones, they actually depend on whether Dan Heng gets damaged. Everything else, honestly, are on about the same power level. The power level can vary, so if you don't want to obtain the free-to-play Aeon's Light Cone, you can just use one of the other options you have. All in all, I think Imbibitor Lunae Dan Heng is really strong, even if it does mean you have to play around the excessive amount of skill points he will consume. Right now, I think he's a pretty advanced damage dealer for new players, not in the sense that he's complex to play, but more like you need to build a team around him in a correct way, which essentially boils down to speeding everyone up, while he's the slowest of them all, or in reverse, build everyone's speed up, including his, and take advantage of comps like the ones where you use Bronya. But just to be clear, I don't mean that he's restricted to playing Bronya this way. No. In fact, I had some really great results by just using a comp like Tingyun, Bronya, and Luocha, where Tingyun helps with Dawn's ultimate energy generation, and in return, with all the buffing active, he still usually has enough SP or stacks to unleash the triple powered basic. Now, if I had one complaint about him, then it would be how terrible it feels to use him in auto combat. As pretty as he looks, the new Dan Heng is pretty dumb, at least when it comes to managing the stacks and skill points in auto combat. He will just blindly use up all the skill points and stacks to unleash the enhanced basic attack, and often he will target the wrong enemies. So like, his main targets are usually smaller mobs instead of an elite or boss, while the boss or elite gets damage from the adjacent hits. Honestly, all this means is that you will spend a little more time than usual in the auto, but hey, it's not like it really hurts a lot. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. This new Dan Heng is pretty fun to play with, and I cannot wait to see how much better he becomes in the future, because there's still a lot of room left for improvement when it comes to teammates. But yeah, thanks for watching the video, and see you next time.